All right there, welcome everybody. My name's Scott Maier, this is Drawing Together with Artists Network. We meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So this is what we're working on today, this cool shot of the Colosseum in Rome. So the real challenge here is, I think for the first thing that stood out to me at least was the perspective. So this is a great opportunity to explore some more kind of complex architectural subjects and dig into some perspective. So let's dig right into it. If you're new, you're going to want to know that you can draw along with us. That's what this show is all about. So there's the link in the description below where you can find the reference image. You can bring that up, draw along with us. There's a list of the materials as well. And there's also a link that I pinned in the chat and in the description. So if you want to share your work when you're done, go ahead. And so this one in particular, I feel like it can be kind of completed really with any medium. So I chose charcoal for this just because I'm in the mood, like last week, to just kind of push charcoal around. There's going to be a lot of kind of working through problems on the page, and I feel like this charcoal is going to kind of get me there a little bit faster than graphite. So that's why I chose charcoal, but like I said, I think if you're working with just regular pencil, I think that you can do the you can achieve the same results. So I love to see comments in the chat here. So feel free to throw out any observations, suggestions for improvement. What are you doing in your drawing? How are you approaching it differently? Any questions you might have for me or anybody in the group. This is all about us working together to get through this subject. So let's dig into it. If you do have any questions, it's helpful to type them out in all caps. I can identify them more quickly if we happen to get a lot of comments. So, all right, let's look at the materials I have. This is a little bit smaller than in some of the previous drawings. So this is about an 8x10 drawing, just a smooth white drawing paper that I've got here. My charcoal, I've got vine charcoal that I'm going to be building up a lot of the initial gestural work with. And then I decided to go with the 4B and the 6B today of these charcoal pencils. A little bit darker. The one that you just saw here, the preparatory drawing, was actually done with the 2B and the 4B charcoal. But I don't really have a good reason why I chose the 4B and the 6B. That's just what I grabbed today. Erasers, I've got my rubber eraser and my kneaded eraser here. So I'm using this Derwent retractable one that I've kind of shaved down into this kind of chisel tip to give me a little bit more detail. If I need it, I have a kind of a larger rubber eraser as well that I can go to. Trusty blending stump if I need it. And paper towel. We're going to be doing a lot of kind of building up of material, wiping it down, building it up, wiping it down. And then I have just this strip of just a thicker paper that I'll be using as a straight edge, as a basic guide rather than a ruler. I like using a strip of paper because it's so thin. It can be a little bit tricky to work with, but I'll show you how I use it in a subject like this. So before we get started, I just want to shout out to everybody. I see so many familiar names. I want to say hi to everybody. I love seeing that, especially some of these names that have been with us since the beginning. We're a little over a year now, so I think last week was the 1-year anniversary for this whole show, so I can't believe it. It's been awesome. So this is episode 87. If you want to see any of the past episodes, go to the Drawing Together page on Artists Network, where you can see all of them, or here on YouTube, there's a playlist there. So let's dig right into it. So I'm going to grab my vine charcoal, and I think in general my approach to this subject is to use drawing as a way to think through the subject. So this isn't necessarily about creating a fully rendered drawing and getting into all of those details. I want the challenge of the perspective here for today, and I want to kind of work things out on the page. And so this could get messy, it could fall apart entirely, but you may have a different kind of approach. With this subject, there's such really kind of nice detail and textural work that you can really dig into. So you may decide that you want to have something that's a bit cleaner, a bit more precise. That's totally fine, but I just want to kind of describe my approach today, because this is all about just kind of wrapping my head around the perspective. So the first thing I want to do is lay down the initial gesture. And this is really the approach that I've taken with pretty much every subject so far. So using the vine charcoal, I'm just reacting very quickly to the subject, not thinking about it too much. Now it helps that I've drawn this before. That's one of the reasons I do the preparatory drawings. It helps me to think through the subject a little bit more, come up with a plan, and be able to describe what what are the key takeaways that could be helpful for students. It's all very light right now. Let me see, it's a little bit blown out. Let me see if I can adjust the, there we go. There we go. I'm going to drop that down a little bit so we can see some of the marks a little bit better. And I'm not really thinking too much about what I'm doing or why, just going with the gut at this point. And as I've described in a lot of these episodes, these initial gestures are all about kind of getting information on the page, because then it allows you to make more specific decisions as we work through the subject. Having something on the page, if it's wrong, you can see it more clearly and come up with a clearer plan about how to fix it. If we try to work it all out in our heads first and then kind of execute on it, it makes it a little bit more challenging to kind of correct and to observe the issues that need to be adjusted and corrected. So some of these are marks that are going to stay through the rest of the drawing. Most of them are just going to kind of disappear. So I have kind of two main directions that I'm looking at. There's the vertical structure. You see these kind of paths, these pillars, and then there's the circular form. And that, so with the Colosseum, it's really more of a cylindrical form. I believe it's an ovoid shape, but it's really kind of largely cylindrical, and so we have those two dimensions that we need to kind of account for here. And so that's really what I'm focusing on more now, and then we'll continue to adjust the proportions as we go. So what I'm looking at is you can kind of see the radiating nature of these vertical lines. If you look at this main structure here on the left, it looks like it is perfectly vertical, this outer edge right here. And then as we move across to the right, those primary vertical elements start to radiate out from a point that's above the drawing. And if you have a long straight edge, you might even kind of identify where that point would be and actually use that straight edge to create a kind of like a radiating structure there. So I'm not worried so much about the spacing of these at this point, but I'm mostly just trying to see what are those angles. So at this point, what one of the tools that you can be using a lot is angle sighting. So if you're not familiar with angle sighting, what that means is if you have your reference in front of you, whether you're drawing from life or in this case from a photograph, with that in front of you, close one eye, take a straight piece. I'll use my pencil here, and I'm holding that vertically. I'm aligning it with this edge here. I'm going to carry it and transfer it directly on top of the drawing. And in that way, I can kind of move across the drawing and identify the angles. So you're physically transferring an angle from the reference onto the drawing. And so as I get to that outer edge, what can get kind of tricky is that those two dimensions that we talked about, the circular dimension and then the vertical element, they kind of converge at this side. It's hard to distinguish between what is what there. And so again, this isn't necessarily about having anything that's accurate at this point. It's just really just, it's more for my mental benefit. I'm trying to wrap my head around the subject, because we're going to end up wiping this all down, and we're going to keep building this repeatedly. We're going to do this multiple times, and each time we do, hopefully it'll get a little bit better. Maybe let me see. Hello, everybody. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. If you do have any questions as we get started, just let me know. I want to start to identify this angle. So, there's this ledge along that, along this main structure here. Now its placement is probably incorrect, but my target right now is getting the angles correct. And so one of the things you can see too is that there are lines that run this way that kind of radiate out along here, but then there's also lines that seem to radiate down like this. So as we know, we're looking up at this structure. It's really a worm's eye view. So if the horizon line is down below, being cropped off out of the image. But as we get closer to that horizon line, these lines here are going to become more horizontal. As they move up, they become more angled. And so we can see that pretty clearly in these elements here. So as you look at this main structure, you can see how these lines seem to, again, kind of radiate from largely horizontal at the bottom to steeper at the top. So I'm not doing anything precise with the perspective on this. It's really kind of an intuitive approach to perspective that we're taking here, and having a general understanding of what should be happening with the structure. But like I said, if you do feel more comfortable identifying the specific vanishing point and placing it on your drawing table or your easel somewhere, then you can go ahead and do that. And now for this curve, I'm trying to generally angle sight and break that curve down into a few straight sections. So kind of 1, 2, 3, and then we'll eventually round those out. So this is all making a mess on the page, which is kind of what I was hoping for. Again, this is kind of about using the drawing process to solve these problems and think through these problems, as opposed to kind of using this medium as a way to kind of execute on a specific vision. It's not about necessarily making it nice and clean, but trying to just wrap my head around the subject. All right, but we can start to see even in this early phase, you could show this to somebody and say, hey, that reminds me of the Colosseum, right? And it's going to look a bit wonky. It's not accurate, of course, at this point, but that's kind of the hope, is that we start from this position of kind of general recognition, and then we're going to gradually kind of extract more clarity out of the subject here as we wrap our heads around the subject. One of the things that, in this initial pass that becomes clear to me too is the importance of these shadows in the openings of these square windows up here, and then these arches down in here. And we'll talk a little bit about these curves and these arches and how to address those. And we can see as we move across here, looking at the reference, we're really starting to shear across the structure at that point. And so it's, we're just seeing very thin slivers of light and shadow. And so we may have to make a decision about how to address those. How much detail do we want to add? And how much can we ignore? One of the things that's a little bit challenging is because this is taped down, I have to kind of contort myself to make some of these lines. If I were able to, I would be able to kind of rotate the drawing a little bit. So, all right, hello everybody. If anybody's new, I'd love to hear where you are viewing from. And then, and if you have any kind of specific challenges that you might be facing, and it may not even be about this subject in particular, but if you have something related to drawing that you think could be addressed here, and we as a community can perhaps provide some insight. So one of the things, what I was doing in here is that you can see these ledges in the reference image. You can see these ledges that wrap kind of around the columns there, and they have really kind of nice angular sides. And what I'm looking at is that change in angle as you wrap around the form. And again, you can use some angle sighting, and what can happen sometimes when you're looking at a complex subject like this is that we end up fighting our own minds a little bit. And we've talked about this before in previous episodes, especially when it comes to perspective, is that our visual system is designed to understand the world around us. So it takes in the optical information and it converts it into an electrical signal that our brain interprets, and it's all about understanding what is most valuable about the subject. And that can be kind of confusing because optically what's happening is, we have these kind of angled lines here, but we know that they're actually parallel with the ground. So then we have like this internal struggle between the optical truth of the subject, which is that it's angled, with the literal truth, which is actually it's horizontal, it's parallel with the ground, or that these lines here, in truth, are all kind of, they're all radiating out of that same center. They're almost parallel with one another, but because of that perspective and because of that turn, we have very specific and kind of distinct angles. And so the optical truth may not necessarily align with the literal truth of this. And so we kind of fight that. So one way to address that is to, again, close one eye, so you're flattening your depth perception, align a pencil or a piece of charcoal with, say, this angle here, lock your wrist so you're maintaining that angle, and then compare it to the next one over here. And in that way, you can see that they actually change. And you can see by how much they change. And you keep carrying it across, and by the time you work over here, the angle that you have over here is radically different from the angle of that ledge that's on this side, if that makes sense. So again, kind of closing one eye and flattening that depth perception, that perspective there, will help you to compare that, and so you can really confront the optical truth from the subject with what your mind might be twisting in order to make sense of the subject. If that makes sense. So so that was my first pass. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wipe this all down. I know Greg, last week we talked about, if you're watching, we talked about kind of addressing the arches and those curves there. So I'll try to get into that perspective a little bit. And then Brenda reached out and had some questions about how to get rid of blotches. And so I have a feeling that's going to happen here. We're going to have some of these areas here that are going to get a little blotchy. And I'll show you kind of how to smooth that out. Okay, so I have the ghost of that image on there now. We're just going to take another pass, but this time I'm going to give it a little bit more attention, pay a little bit more attention to the proportions. Now, the dimensions of this are slightly different than the reference. So I sized the reference for a 9 by 12. This is an 8 by 10. And so I think, what do I need to do? I might end up having to crop this off a little bit here on the right. What I want to do is we have this main structure here on the left that, again, on the right side is perfectly vertical. And then we have this secondary, the cylindrical structure over here. And what I want to do is compare this distance to this distance over here. And so I'm going to use comparative measuring for that. So I'm going to use my charcoal, align it with this side of the drawing, align my thumb with this edge here, and placing directly on top of the reference. And then I'm going to compare that to this proportion here. And what am I seeing? I'm seeing one, let's see. All right, so it's about 1.5 times. Let's see, so if I take this dimension here, I can carry this over 1 and about 1/2 to get me to the edge of the building. So I'm pretty close. I'll drop an angle here. And this is what I was kind of talking about, confronting the optical truth with the literal truth. We know that the Colosseum is a vertical structure, but because of this, the point of view that we're taking this image from and the perspective, this actually can get converted into this very steep angle, right? And that gets really kind of bizarre sometimes, wrapping our heads around that, drawing an angle so that it feels correct, that it feels actually vertical. So in that way, that's part of the illusion of drawing. So now what I'm doing is we have these 3 kind of main levels here, and I took this dimension, and that equates to the second level. So from the bottom of the image to this first ledge is the same as from this ledge to the next one, and then the next one is about 1/2 of that distance. So let me just double check. There we go. Yeah, about 1/2. So then I can take this, I'm going to just indicate the intersections there on the page, and that kind of puts it along there. So in that way, I'm kind of giving myself the main parameters within which I'll work. And then what I'll do, let's see, we have these lines here. We have these lines that curve, and they all kind of converge over on this side. I think I need to give myself a few more landmarks. So I'm still working with the vine charcoal because it's all very light. And I'm going to stick with this for a while because what that's also going to do is it's going to build up this haze of charcoal that I'm going to be able to go back in later and kind of erase out the highlights. You can see there it's just starting to lift up some of the lights, which can be really helpful later. So I'll be able to do some negative drawing. So that's why I'm sticking with the vine charcoal. I'm not worried about protecting any of the page. I want this to kind of enrich itself with the layers of charcoal. One of the things you can do if you don't have a straight edge, you don't want to measure this out, you can use the edge of the paper as a guide. So I don't know if you can kind of see, my pinky is kind of locked in along the edge of the paper here. I can take that dimension, kind of lock my wrist, and then just score up and down the length of the paper. So use the side of the paper to create that, that straight line there. So then I got to reestablish that. And so what I'm going to do is angle sight. I know the placement of that intersection, but I'm going to angle sight and actually indicate the angle of that intersection line. So at this point, what is that angle there that eventually becomes kind of a curve? Okay, let's see. And I prefer to use the side of the pencil as much as possible, or not even the pencil, the vine charcoal. And then one of the things you can see too, which is kind of cool, is that with this main building here, structure here, it's vertical along this edge, but as we move across to the left here, you get a very distinct angle. Again, that's the 3-point perspective that we're working with. And then as we kind of work through the main structure, once we're happy that we're getting these basic angles right in the main proportions. Then we can go in and actually add some more specificity to the marks. Well, you switch to that the compressed charcoal sticks. But again, this is all about using the drawing process as a way to think through the challenge of this, rather than try to figure it all out in your head and then execute on the page. This is the messy part of drawing that I find the most thrilling, and what I think is really really the power of charcoal is its ability to get messy. And so as I encounter these curves, at this point I'm just kind of making an intuitive interpretation of them. And then we'll go through and adjust, and if we need to, we'll apply some kind of principles of perspective that could be helpful. Let's see. Okay, I need to lock in some of the main kind of lines here. So I want to get really these three main levels identified. And what's cool about when working in perspective is that if you get the main form correct, then all of the details fall into place more easily, because your mind will kind of calibrate to the perspective, and if the details are off, it'll become more apparent. And so if you focus on the primary form, then everything else falls in line more easily. And so if you're feeling intimidated by the subject and you feel like it's just too much detail, focus on these main elements first. And kind of go from there. So I need to, what do I want to do? All right, so now I need to identify the placement of these features here. So what I have to do is I have on the screen in front of me, I have what you're seeing right now. So that's the overhead shot, and that's vertical. And I need to be relying on that more, because as I look here from this angle, the angles are more extreme than they actually are. They appear more extreme than they actually are. So I need that overhead shot. That's what's keeping me in check. And I need to be drawing from that more, because if I rely on this angle that I'm looking at to evaluate the perspective and the proportions, then I'm ultimately going to get myself into trouble. There we go. That feels a little bit better. This line here, this vertical edge, is really the key. I think everything kind of anchors around that, because that's the part that really messes with my head. Because that building because it's receding away from us, I have a tendency, I want to feel like it's actually moving off to the left, but it's not, it's straight. And so my brain is kind of trying to correct things, and it's messing with the perception of it all. I don't know, how's everybody else doing? Anybody stuck? We're going to be sticking with this gesture for a while, so it's going to look pretty messy for a little while. But Greg is making an observation. It looks like you lock your wrist and make the larger curves more with your arm. That's exactly it. Right now, I don't really have the ability to kind of use the natural arc of my arm, kind of pivot around my wrist and draw these curves, just because of the nature of the angle and how it's all set up. But so I have to do it that way. And I think I think I can get into trouble when I rely on the pivot of the wrist, because if I try to go like this, then I end up repeating the same curve over and over again. It may not be the accurate curve. It may not be what I'm actually looking for, what I need. Okay, so I kind of dropped this this opening here, this arch. So as I'm going through, I'm trying to think through what I'm actually doing, because I think there's a lot of stuff that's happening. It's all happening very quickly. So I'm trying to look at the specific shapes of these arches. Now they're not 100% accurate, but I'm trying to kind of understand them a little bit better. But I also need to do kind of a check-in with other elements. So this is where kind of a horizontal guide could be helpful. So if you were to envision a horizontal line coming out the top of this arch, where does it intersect over here? And that can be a way to help double check the proportions, because this may not be correct. And so I might have to, I think I do have to adjust this downward a little bit. Now the other thing that I'm doing is looking at the negative space. So use that negative space to help evaluate the curves, because again, this is where we might be confronted by the brain calculating things for us in ways that may not actually be helpful to drawing. We know those arches to be generally circular, but because of our point of view and the perspective, they're actually these really kind of unique, kind of squished shapes that have kind of an axis that's angled. That's the angle that we were looking at before. So you have that general axis, and you have that circular form as drawn in perspective. And so it's a very complex form, and that's why I think this subject is really kind of a cool challenge. And so before I start to actually use any kind of real principles of perspective to drive this, I'm going to use angle sighting, comparative measuring, plumb lines, horizontal guides, looking at intersection points, looking at positive space and negative space, things like that, to kind of give myself kind of a rough estimate of what those curves should be. And then I can start to use perspective to kind of rein myself in or correct things as I need to. So still some gestural thinking here. And that's why I'm sticking with the vine charcoal, because it's so easy to kind of wipe away. And I think these basic proportions are feeling pretty good. So if you're kind of stuck here on these curves, we'll kind of address them a little bit more. We're going to keep going in and making them more specific. But what can be helpful at this stage is to be thinking about the positive and negative space. So I'm using my finger to kind of cut back in to some of these curves and just kind of move the material around. But think about, this shape here, and then this negative space in here, and then how that's different from this one. And so you might also apply some kind of indirect observation. So as you're looking at this, put your awareness on this and try to see how they're different when you're looking at the subject. Now one of the things that was really kind of challenging was getting each of these layers to align when I was working on the preparatory drawing. So I want to focus on that a little bit more. So as I'm moving my way up, I've kind of have an indication of where that next ridge is for that level. I'm going to kind of work back and forth between those two. So if that's my parameter right there, I have the inner and outer edges. I'm going to kind of work back and forth to try to find then the height of that window. The other thing I can use is this ledge here. So if I'm feeling good about the placement of this ledge, I can use that here, and it breaks it apart into these negative spaces here. I can compare that to this next arch up here. and then start to form the structures that way. You know, what's hard about perspective is that it, you know, it really kind of calls to want to pull out the ruler, you know, and get really precise, and that can be, it's kind of an essential part, especially if you're looking for something that's kind of clean and sharp and makes sense. But it can be really helpful to get in the mud of the drawing a little bit to help discover that main structure and really understand the form before getting involved with all of the details. And so I'm going to try to illustrate that here and kind of live up to that by, again, staying in the mud of the drawing for a little while in this. All right, so what can be helpful now is to, if I've got these first two openings here and I'm happy with the general placement, I can start to visualize that path along this stretch, that section of the column, that layer there, and let that help guide the tops of the windows along in there. And I have to remind myself to also kind of do a check-in with this bottom layer. And this is where I got into some trouble in the preparatory one, is I kind of isolated this layer from this layer and they weren't quite lining up. And then I did the same with the top, and then those angles shifted a little bit and they weren't quite placed. So I'm trying to maintain a focus on the relationship between those three layers first, stay with that for a while, and kind of trust that if I do that, then all those details are going to come together very quickly at the end. So there's a lot of kind of trust that needs to happen in this drawing, and kind of anticipate, you know, anticipate kind of some future things that are actually going to help pull this together. And then what gets really tricky as we work down here is that you have kind of variations in the structure, and you know, you have like these stained elements and you have light and shadow, and it gets really confusing to determine what's what. All right, so give myself a little bit of some of those details. I kind of like what's happening along that ledge. I want that to be a bit of a focal point. Now, one of the things that can happen here is, you know, I could end up getting kind of curves, natural curves in these lines, just by the natural pivot of the wrist. Let's see, but we'll go through and start to correct that a little bit later. And then this is all going to get wiped down. So again, nothing is going to be permanent here. But this is really more for the benefit of my brain, building up some muscle memory. But we're going to just keep tackling this over and over again. And this might be how I would approach the drawing if I were actually on location here. I might actually approach the drawing this way. And really just, this is all about problem solving. So and this is one of the things you can see in the image in the thumbnail for this, is that there's a change in the angle from here to here, and it makes it feel like that top layer is just kind of angled out just a little bit. So I didn't do a great job of ensuring that that the axis that might run through these columns is consistent through each of those layers. So something you might, again, look at the thumbnail of this and you'll observe that. So that's one of the things I want to address in this one here. Now, so in addition to getting the axes correct, you can also use plumb lines to help adjust things. So what plumb lines are just vertical elements that run down from whatever your target is. So if I'm looking at the inner corner of this window, for example, if I draw a vertical line down there, I can see where it passes through elements below it or above it. And I can compare that to what I would observe from the reference image. So if I close one eye and use a pencil as a guide, hold it vertically, align it with this inner point, I can see how it runs down this way. And then I can move across to the next window. And in that way, it'll help me to place the elements there. I'm comparing this vertical alignment of this inner portion of the window with this element down in here, as well as looking at these axes. So I'm trying to vary the observations as much as possible. So again, looking at kind of the axes as they're drawn in perspective, using plumb lines, horizontal guides, all sorts of things, because each one is going to give us another type of observation and kind of puts the others in check. All right, so I said I was going to wipe this down. Here we go. All right, but I'm doing it very lightly. I can see the ghost of it all down in here, and I'm feeling pretty good. I'm just kind of comparing the reference image to the drawing, and I'm feeling pretty good about them right now. So I think I can start to get in there and add a little bit more detail to it. So this has all been done so far with the vine charcoal. So now I'm going to pick up the 4B. The preparatory drawing that I had done was using using a 2B at this stage, but I think I made the last minute decision to switch to the 4B and 6B. So let's see, Stranger in Moscow, I'm a bit late. Is charcoal the same as an F grade pencil? No, so charcoal is going to get a lot darker than an F grade pencil. So if you are using graphite and you want to get these dark values, then you might want to go to like a 6B or an 8B, or if you have like an ebony pencil, something like that, or an onyx pencil by Derwent, a carbon pencil, something that gets you a little bit darker. But I think for this, because the main focus is on perspective, you can really use whatever material that you want. So again, this is all about problem solving on the page and using drawing as a way to better understand the subject. And so if this is something that you really like and you want to get into the details, and you might do a few preparatory sketches to really understand that perspective, get the main form in correctly, and then that third or fourth attempt really kind of focus on those details. You'll have worked out all the perspective in your mind. So as I draw this vertical line, I have this outer edge of the page that I can feel against my palm, and I'm just kind of dragging down like that, locking the wrist, keeping a consistent distance, and trying to maintain a consistent distance from the right edge. I'm sorry, and that creates generally a vertical edge. All right. So now what I'm doing is I'm just using the side of this 4B pencil, and I'm going to try to observe the overall shape. And kind of lock in some of these values. But to kind of get back to Greg's observation, for the most part, when I'm drawing these angles, I'm locking the wrist and trying to draw from the shoulder as much as possible. I find that it ultimately leads to a more fluid mark, and I get to the perspective and the curves a little bit more quickly. There's some blemishes in the paper that are catching the charcoal a little bit. And if that becomes a problem, I'll address that a little bit later. Now this curve is really tricky because I want to try to get in like this and I can't, so I'm going to have to come in from above and try to get this curve correctly. And you can see, you just use the side of the pencil. It's not that sharp edge because I want to make sure that general path is correct. And then if I need to sharpen it up, that's where the eraser comes in. And we can kind of cut that back out. So we'll do some positive and negative drawing there. And it's part of the nature of this subject is that it's, it's, of course, these ruins. So precision doesn't necessarily help with this. It kind of lends itself to having these kind of jagged and irregular marks. So I would just encourage you, if you're following along, to continue to stick with this main form as long as you can. And all of these marks will just add to the character, the nature of the building. All right, what do I want to do here? This is going to be really the focal point. It's going to be over in this area here. And as I move across, I want to let that just fade into the light. And, because that perspective, it gets really tricky to see the edges of some of these things. So we're just going to kind of suggest that. If you need to, squint at the subject as much as possible, if that's helpful for you, because then what you'll observe there when you squint is what is important with regards to detail. When we focus on things, we can sometimes increase the contrast in our minds, and so we see things with more clarity than the kind of really the optical truth of the subject. Things are actually closer together in the reference than we might really be aware of when we focus on things. So let your eyes just lose focus. All right, so. What do I want to do here? This is requiring a bit more kind of thinking than some of the other ones, and I'm finding that I might have to do less talking as I work through some of these things here. So all right, thank you everybody. Aaron is saying, admire your ability to just eyeball things. I would have a ruler. I obviously need more practice. I wouldn't say that. I have, again, I have this straight edge here, just a thick piece of paper that I can use, and I'll be bringing that out. I've just learned that when I bring that out too soon, it actually causes trouble. And so I'm trying to kind of force myself to stay with this freehand drawing a little bit longer because it's a little bit faster, first off, and I can stay in the mode of really thinking through these major forms a bit more easily. And also, I found that when drawing with a ruler, the marks tend to be just more permanent. And I'm not ready for that yet. Like, I don't think I have it quite figured out. And once I'll bring out that ruler when I know where I need to really place those sharp edges. Let's see. I just had this thought to kind of address the curves in the openings here. I want to think through that. First, I want to drop in these lines here represent those ledges there in the and along these columns. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm just kind of, I'm still roughing in these forms, thinking back and forth between the positive space and the negative space. So looking at that shape in through the opening there. And I'm intentionally using this kind of overhand grip So I create these very light marks, and because I'm using the side of the pencil, it floats on the surface a little bit more. If I shift to this, it gives me two challenges. One is that it's a little bit more challenging to control the pressure, so I end up pushing down a little bit more, and it's engaging the tip, which is going to emboss the page. And also it makes it's a little bit more difficult to lock my wrist. I mean, you can still kind of do it, but it kind of promotes that natural movement, and so I tend to create these curved marks when I hold it like that. So when I hold it like this in an overhand grip, it just encourages kind of more fluid marks and marks that float on that surface a little bit more. Okay, so I think I'm just about, I want to talk through some of what I'm thinking about in terms of the perspective. Let me grab, so one of the things that could be really helpful when you're working perspective is to understand what perspective center is. So this is what I come to all the time, is if you have a square, or a rectangle, you can find its center by simply drawing these lines that cut from opposing corners. So that gives us the center. You put that into perspective. So say you create a rectangle that's drawn in perspective. The center isn't the mid distance between these lines. The center is actually going to be a little bit farther back optically. So if you divide that rectangle that's drawn in perspective, again by connecting the opposing corners, you see that for the correct perspective, given the perspective, its center is much closer to the right side. And now you can then build that even farther to draw in a curve. So then if you were to draw an arch, find, say if it starts curving at the midsection there, draw a line that cuts through the center, cuts through your perspective center, and is consistent with the perspective, so that these edges here all converge at a common vanishing point. You can start your curve of the arch at this intersection point, and you know that by the time you get up here to the center, it's going to be angled here. That helps you to see that curve, and then you know that then the curve here along this side has to be kind of squished into this space here. So it's vertical when you get down here, it's kind of horizontal but drawn in perspective at the top here, and that'll help you to see that curve. So finding perspective center can be really helpful. Now I haven't done that with the specific drawing, but you can start to envision that. You can kind of project that in your mind a little bit, but if you have a hard time with that, then actually draw it out. So what you might do is make, say, this opening here a rectangle that's drawn in perspective, find perspective center, and then find the center of that arch here. And then from there, it'll help you to find the specific curve. So what you're essentially doing is you're drawing the bottom and the top lines here as drawn in perspective. You're drawing your vertical edges as drawn in perspective. You're going to find where the curve starts and draw a line there that's consistent with perspective. Find your perspective center, and then from there you're going to find that top, where that arch meets that top that's drawn in perspective. And so you can kind of approach that curve from starting on the outer edges, working your way in, knowing that it's going to make a straight line at the base. It's going to be at a very fine point, it's going to be angled this way, and then it's going to meet back down in here and be vertical. And so you have these 3 points that you can then kind of connect together to create that arch. So hopefully that makes sense. And then the same can be done in that back edge, or you can kind of eyeball it. So it can be really helpful to find the front perspective of that arch, and then use that as a guide to the back for that back edge. So hopefully that makes sense. Perspective is really kind of a tricky thing. But if you understand the fundamentals, say one point perspective and 2 point perspective, and you know perspective center, that gets you so much. so you might just practice those things for a little while. If that's something that you're really interested in, those are the things that I end up using the most. But as you can see, the process that I use here is to bring that out after I've done angle sighting, after I've done some comparative measuring and using all the other drawing tools. So rather than initiating a drawing by using perspective, by finding the horizon line, the orthogonals, the lines that recede to a vanishing point, finding the vanishing points, all of those things, I start with those other drawing techniques and then use perspective to help correct anything that might be off. And I do that because when I initiate a drawing in perspective, using perspective, most often I don't have the correct placement of the horizon line and the vanishing point, right? So if those are off and everything is built around those, then everything else is off. So it's kind of like you start with a gesture and then from there really lock in where the vanishing points should be and then adjust the structure from there and kind of work back and forth and be willing to move those vanishing points as you need to. Now I know that's a lot because this isn't necessarily a lesson in how perspective works entirely. So you may be entirely new to perspective and you might be lost on a lot of what we just said. But I can do my best to try to address it here if we need to. So, because what I've observed, and I guess the main reason I'm saying that is what I've observed is that sometimes I'll have students that really understand the drawing process well. They understand plumb lines and comparative measuring and angle sighting, all of that stuff that's helpful. But then something happens when in the brain that when we're confronted by perspective, and all of a sudden, like the brain just freezes up, and so I say just stick with what you normally do. Like those primary tools, you can really do any drawing that way, and you can get the end result. But there can be sometimes something about perspective that really confuses people. And if that is you, just know that you're not alone. I've just found that for some reason, some people it clicks with more naturally than others. But the more you practice it, the more kind of intuitive it will be. I have a course on Artist Network on perspective drawing that I'll try to post here after the event. And the whole purpose of that video, that course, is to discuss perspective in a way in which perspective becomes intuitive. So you don't get bogged down by the specifics of the vanishing points, horizon lines, and all these terms that can really weigh down the whole drawing process. And if you build an intuitive understanding of perspective, you can get at more accurate drawing more quickly. So I can see it right happening. This is exactly what I was talking about in my preparatory sketch. We have the axis here, and it seems to change a little bit at the top. So I want to be kind of mindful of that as we go. I may end up having to kind of adjust slightly. The slightest change can become apparent in this whole process. So, and that's what I mean when you get the main structure correct, you get that perspective, then all those details, if they're inaccurate, they become more noticeable if you get that main structure correct. JC, because it's the dreaded P word. Very useful tricks. All right, just reading some of the Casper's saying very useful tricks and tips. Thank you. On a side note, drawing on a live stream, I'd be so afraid that I would fail big time. That is very true for me. I just, I think I get good at hiding that fear. And this is episode 87, so I've kind of gotten more comfortable, and especially, you know, meeting so many of you virtually, you are all a very kind of patient and understanding group here. So and you have all helped me tremendously through some of these trouble spots. So I thank you all for that. But that's kind of the point of the show. Is it's really all about us getting together and sharing our thoughts on drawing, and working through these subjects together. So as opposed to a demonstration of expert drawing, because I do not consider myself to be, you know, the most expert of drawers, of giraffes people. So, but you know, I think that drawing really is, it's a practice that I had neglected for too long. You know, it's one of those things, you go to art school or something, you take classes, and it's kind of, then you learn painting, and then for some reason drawing just kind of goes away. And I had realized at the start of this whole pandemic that I needed to devote a bit more time to drawing so that my painting would improve. And that has definitely been the case. And then as a community, we can kind of hold each other accountable, kind of work on things together. All right, so I'm just kind of reestablishing those. I'm not afraid of going too dark here. You can see I just keep wiping it down, building it back up, wiping it down, because I'll use my eraser to lift out some of the highlights. But I do think, let me see, we're about an hour in, so about halfway through the drawing time. So generally they take a couple hours. I think what I want to do, this is where I'm going to pull out the straight edge, and I just want to be kind of targeting the axes here. And mostly what I'm looking at is the axes of these three main levels. Because I just want to unify those. Again, try to learn from my mistake. So if this were long enough, then what I would do is actually put an anchor way up here where that vanishing point would be, and then physically kind of rotate this across. Let's see if I can line that up. And so I'm going to have to kind of do this by eye here. I'm going to do some angle sighting. How are we doing? So this for example, like this, it looks correct from here. From my perspective here, it looks spot on. And I look at it here where it's vertical and it's off. So I have to go by what you are all seeing, as opposed to my perspective in front of me here. So if you haven't done so already, let me see, I'm going to place that there. Okay. There we go. So that feels a little bit better. And so with this straight edge, this is just a strip of paper, and I intentionally use an overhand grip. It creates a fine line, and again, it floats it across the surface a little bit more than if I were to use a tripod grip. And now one of the things you could do, so the optical truth of this, the optical nature of this is that these should actually be curved a bit. So as we move down here, you can start to create kind of a fisheye effect by making these lines here more vertical and then gradually curving as we move up. And some artists do that. So I think of somebody like Rackstraw Downs who does that. He allows these lines to curve through space. If you haven't checked out his work, it's a real lesson in perspective when you look at it. He paints on location, and he'll create these kind of fisheye paintings, and he allows those lines to curve and bend in a way that I think is really fascinating. All right, so what I'm doing here is trying to find that angle there that runs through the center, the high point of the arches from front to back, and that will help me to then kind of create some of that depth here. I can change the direction of my marks to reinforce that perspective. And now, let me see. So I'm going to place this down here, do some angle sighting. So I'm placing this on the drawing, closing one eye, aligning it with the kind of the targeted angle, moving it across, and now it aligns with this. So this, when I'm looking at the screen in front of me, the pencil is aligned perfectly with this, and I can adjust that as I need to. And I'm going to do the same with that next ledge. I want to do this one up here as well. And try to just sharpen up some of those edges a bit. And actually, I think I want to do that with just this kind of intersection here, where that curve initiates. Because that's again, from my point of view from here, and I look at this, it looks all off. But I look on the screen and what you're seeing, and it looks more correct. So I need to trust that. So I need to be drawing from that projection in front. Let me see. Cynthia, your Colosseum looks crappy, but you're having fun. That's awesome. Well, Ed, I hope you're being kind to yourself there. So let's see. Stranger in Moscow, what type of paper am I using? I think if you want to use a material, the paper that is right for your medium. So if you're using graphite, kind of a smooth white drawing paper should work. If you're using charcoal, you're using something that's designed for charcoal. This is actually a bamboo paper. Let me see if I can find the pad. It's a Hanamula bamboo that I really like for charcoal. And it's very similar to a cotton rag paper. That also works very well for charcoal. So if you're using like a smooth white drawing paper, it may not hold the charcoal very effectively. So just be kind of mindful of that. Now I have to, this is where if I didn't have this tape down, I would actually be turning the paper to kind of suit the natural curve, the arc of my hand here, but I don't. So just adding another layer of specificity, and then I'm going to get in there and start to add some of the detail. So try to hold off on the detail until you've really got the perspective figured out. So something seems off here. So as you're going through, it's all like putting together a puzzle, right? And so I'm kind of working my way across, and I'm seeing that this here feels too long compared to what I'm seeing in the reference. So now I need to compare, I need to figure out what's off. And I think this needs to come down a little bit. This is because it's, again, kind of tricky to contort myself. There we go. That feels a little bit better. So I'm trying to find that curve there. And I like using an overhand grip for drawing straight lines. It kind of lends itself to that. For some reason, I just create more accurate straight lines when I use the side of the pencil. And it's more of kind of drawing from the elbow, drawing from the shoulder to create that edge. And it has a life to it that I really enjoy. And as you can see, I'm bouncing all over the place here, and I'm doing that on purpose because the more you fixate on one area, the more, by the nature of focus itself, you ignore everything else. So if you need to make kind of calculated decisions, or even set like a timer or something that goes off that says, hey, move on to something else. It's kind of moving, you're trying to work the entire drawing at once as much as possible. Because that will ultimately help you to see the relationship between things a bit more accurately. And at this point, sometimes what I really like about charcoal is that I just like the material of it. So sometimes you can, just start making marks that feel good, even though they're not 100% accurate. All right, what am I doing now? I'm going to come back over here. And I don't know if there's really kind of a rhyme or reason when I'm jumping around from one thing to the next, why I'm moving to a specific area. Just something that catches my attention and says, hey, go move on. And I say that needs to be addressed. This is still working with the 4B pencil, by the way. So I have the 6B, which is softer and darker. And I can get in there and add some details. You can see I'm starting to wear this down. I may have to sharpen it a little bit. All right. I think what I need to do is I need to visualize the axes a little bit here. So I'm just I'm putting these lines, they're not spaced properly. I'm just trying to get a sense for that changing angle, those changing angles as we move back. Because everything gets so squished up in here. But it's important to not let the kind of perspective falter too much. So if I were to go in here and I start drawing things this direction, it's just going to really pop off the page. So I need to just be aware of the general direction of the marks. And then it'll hopefully feel more consistent with the perspective. It'll be less distracting. So we're not, even though we're not going to really be finishing anything back in here, whatever marks are on the page should reinforce that perspective. All right, thank you, Danielle. Danielle is asking if I use blending stumps. I do. I haven't used it for this one, but I'll get to that. I kind of forgot about that for this. I usually use the blending stumps, and it's something that I hadn't done prior to this show. I never really liked working with blending stumps because I didn't quite understand how to use them properly. In my mind, the blending stumps were all about just kind of smoothing out your marks, and that felt kind of artificial to me. And it's when I started really realizing that those blending stumps are an opportunity to contribute to the form and really make a statement in the drawing, that's when it kind of clicked that those blending stumps are helpful. So I'll be bringing that out in a little bit. Samantha saying, so is the reference photo next to your projected image? Yes, so I have the reference image here. I have a big monitor in front of me, and the left side is the reference image. The right side is the shot that you're seeing right now. So I see myself, and it's a little creepy, and I see the small thumbnail of the reference that you're seeing, and then I'm seeing the drawing. And so I can compare those two back and forth. And that can be helpful for you and your setup, whether you're drawing from life or whether you're working from a reference photo. Having the two side by side can be really helpful sometimes, just to rein things in. So I'm just kind of giving myself some indication of these bricks, mostly thinking about the perspective as we move through. I just want to darken this ledge as a shadow, and we can go back in and add a little bit of detail to that. Let me see. So trying to think through the major forms, and then one of the things that we've talked about here before in this series is that my approach to drawing, it's not truly unique by any ways, but in general, my approach is to allow the whole drawing to build up. So you start with the big forms and kind of identifying the main kind of features, and you work the whole drawing at once, because then it puts you in control of the detail. And for me, I can sometimes feel a little claustrophobic when I get stuck in the details, but sometimes I want that level of detail. It's just the experience that I want for my own drawing. But like I said, this approach of kind of building it all up puts you in control. You can say, how much detail do you really want as part of your experience today? And so this is going to help to kind of confront that issue. So I want to make sure that visualizing the tops of those arches, and it doesn't quite look right. I don't think I'll ever get used to that idea. Like, I look at it here, and it looks perfect. I look at it up there, and it's way off. So I have to keep reminding myself to look at it vertically. Look at it vertically. It's one of the cool things about art making, drawing from life or observational drawing. All right, I'm gonna wipe that down. I think what I want to do now I can use the eraser. I'll use my rubber eraser that I have sharpened down to this chisel tip. And that's what I'm going to use to kind of refine some of these edges. So as I look at, say, this area in the window, I'm going to start with a light pressure and kind of refine that edge. And now the sky, the blue part of the sky, is a little bit darker in value than that light catching on the edge, or it feels that way. So I'm going to make the decision to bear down a little bit more on the edge of this window and kind of capture that light a little bit there. And then I can do the same thing with this one here. It's just kind of clean up that edge. So start with a really light pressure, work up to that edge, and then I can lean in a little bit more on this, the inner opening of the window, to kind of pull that light out. So I'm kind of doing two things at once. I'm kind of establishing the light and shadow a little bit more, but I'm also correcting the perspective. And don't be afraid to let some of those edges just kind of disappear. So right in here, that's gone. That edge is really kind of disappeared, and that's all right. So when I evaluate it, it still makes sense with regards to the perspective. So, so I don't need to make those edges very explicit. And this is starting to get rid of some of those lines, which is going to add to the realism a little bit more. Imran is asking, how can I prevent my artwork from smudging? That's a tricky one because I'm of the mindset that smudging is good, it's healthy, but it's not for everyone. So if you're looking to prevent it from smudging, then if you have a piece of parchment paper that you can put under your hand, that can be helpful. What I have here on my drawing table, this has got a lip about an inch, inch and a half or so that I can rest my arm on, and that allows me to gain a little bit of support while keeping my hand off the page. But as you can see, I don't really worry about smudging because that's just my approach to it. So hopefully that helps. Like I said, it's not for everybody. Some people prefer to keep things clean in the drawing. But just to kind of know that's where I'm coming from. And so as I'm sharpening this up, I'm not too worried about overrunning. So if I mess up a mark or something like that, I can I can always clean it back up. You can kind of work back and forth between using the eraser, using the charcoal. And I'm just kind of using a very light touch to sharpen up some of these edges here. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the fifth window over is what I'm working on right now. And this is where it's helpful to have that I put those guidelines in so that I can see more correct, see more easily what that correct perspective is, what these angles should be. And I'm just going to let things kind of trail off there, let that fall into the light a little bit. You see that this is starting to build up some charcoal on that edge, which is fine because then it's just smudging a little bit, which is nice. So it's blending as well. So now I'm going to work through let's see. Could you please give an important tip on how to preserve charcoal drawing? Imran. So hopefully, yeah, in terms of preserving your charcoal, I mean, you can use a spray fixative when you're done. I don't typically do that. And I don't really do a great job of preserving my work because these are all really just exercises. So I'm not of the mindset to really preserve these. But if you're looking to do that, I would get a sheet of glassine that you can layer between your drawings. So if you store them flat, then use a sheet of glassine. It's like a clear, thin plastic. To help prevent that. You might try a spray fixative, although some of the spray fixatives will adjust the contrast a little bit. It's sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse, but generally the fixatives, even if they're workable fixatives, can be tricky to continue to adjust. And then, of course, if you have a drawing that you really want to protect, nothing beats putting it in a frame. So putting it behind glass with a mat so that the glass isn't directly on top of the artwork. So I'm just kind of going through and using this sharpened eraser with a very light touch, kind of sharpening and refining the edges. So let me see, there's that ledge there. And I'm kind of double checking before I commit to that and rely on the marks that I've drawn before, keep checking it against the reference photo. Again, just a light touch first. If I do a circular motion, it kind of blends it and smooths it out a little bit more. But this is why I wasn't concerned. I was intending to build up a layer, just wiping it down, building up layers of charcoal so then I have the ability to do some negative drawing here, let's do some subtractive techniques. And then this does give me another opportunity to check my perspective. And where the lines are strong, I'm trying to remove those a little bit. It adds to the realism. The more you get rid of the outlines, the better. If you're going for realism, lines are really helpful when adding kind of expression and kind of interpreting things a little bit more. So I'm just using this almost like a brush. I'm think this is probably how I would actually be painting if I were to be painting this. I would be using my brush in a very similar way. So that's the way I'm thinking about this eraser. So where that line is, I can just kind of tap and it lifts it up a bit and gets rid of that line to some degree. All right, so how's everybody doing? Anybody stuck in any of these parts here? Oh, Daniel, I see your comment here. Going back to the concept of the topic of blending stumps, I think it's helpful. Actually, if I were to bring this out right now, I can actually be drawing with a little bit. I like it. I like to use it to make kind of more subtle marks sometimes, and it can be really helpful when thinking in terms of light and shadow because it can make some really wonderful shadow shapes. I don't know if it's really helping a whole lot here, so let me see as I kind of work through here, it might be helpful to kind of soften some of those edges and indicate some of the shadow shapes there. But yeah, I think I didn't use a blending stump for years. I mean, like I said, I never felt comfortable with them, but because I don't think I had a healthy mindset for how to best utilize them. And now that I feel like I understand them, I think I would recommend them, but at the same time, I learned to draw without using them, and I thought it was just fine. All right, so let me come over here. Again, starting with a lighter pressure to start to refine that, and then gradually increasing the pressure if I need to lift more. And now this is where paper can really make a big difference. So if you're working in charcoal and you're finding that it's just not releasing, you're not able to erase the charcoal, then it's the nature of that paper, and it may not be right for you. Either it's something not aligning with the charcoal you have, or just your approach, and it might be worth it to experiment with different papers. Sometimes I've seen students get hard on themselves because they're saying, what am I doing wrong? I'm not able to erase, and they get really frustrated. and it's really just the paper. You know, there's a lot of science that goes into papers that the various manufacturers do. They do a lot of work to try to make the papers that work right. So, you know, if it says it's rated for charcoal, you should be good if you're working with charcoal, but even within that, sometimes it just, things don't quite work. I notice when, like, I really enjoy drawing with cotton rag paper, but that will often grab the charcoal a little bit more than I would prefer. So sometimes it just doesn't release the charcoal, doesn't erase very cleanly. All right, as I come across here, it's a thin strip of blue there. I like how the eraser kind of provides an opportunity to kind of suggest more detail. It's just kind of cleaning things up a little bit. Just kind of breaking up that line so that it's not so dominant. If I feel good about the axis, then I don't need to have a strong line. Sharpen up some of those. So that's the other thing. One of the things that was really kind of mind-blowing for me when I was learning how to draw was, you know, the power of suggestion. You know, when, you know, really letting the viewer's mind fill in certain information. I think, you know, sometimes we as artists have fear that unless we make every detail explicit, then somehow it's not going to be readable, you know. And it can get really exciting to work with something in high detail, but I think there's a difference between kind of your desires as an artist, right? You know, so if you want to have a certain experience as an artist and say that requires a detail, what can be helpful to know, though, is that the viewer doesn't always need that, right? Our minds are perfectly designed to fill in gaps. So if you give it enough information, then it activates the viewer's mind, and they become actively engaged in completing the image. And so then it can sometimes, when you kind of free yourself from feeling the need to explicitly state everything, then you realize that you can take your drawing to whatever level you like based on the type of experience that you want. Like I was saying earlier, some days I just want to get in there and render every detail. Some days I just want to get in there and make a mess, and engage with the materials in a different way. And so, but it can sometimes be really exciting to just suggest things and allow the viewer's mind to fill in missing information. So this whole section now that it's all drawing with the eraser, kind of cleaning up some of these edges. And then I'll go back in and I'll add some darks as well. This is these little slivers of light kind of coming through what these vertical elements are. Kind of suggest that there. So to be mindful of the perspective. Okay. I don't know. How's everybody feel about detail? How many people are, you know, really kind of obsessed with a detail? Some obsessed with kind of looseness. So as I'm kind of refining this top edge here, it's a very light pressure that I'm applying. And when I need to, I'm kind of trying to pay attention to the blotchiness on the surface. So I'm using a circular motion, and where it's a little bit darker, I'll kind of lean in on a little bit more. So I don't want it to be too bright. So I want to be able to control. I want to bring the brighter areas down here. I think I need to kind of along that edge. I just don't want there to be a kind of a strong halo. So if I see any kind of blotchy areas, like right in here, it's a little bit darker, I might press in a little bit more, utilizing the side of the pencil. Circular marks generally are good for that. Smooth it out. Kind of a kneaded eraser can be helpful as well. So what you can do is if you, so say you want an area here and you want it nice and smooth, but you get, so you get a blotch like that on there and you're like, oh, I don't like that. Way you can fill that in is you take your kneaded eraser and just kind of tap away at it. And if that doesn't do it, let's see if I'll simulate that because I feel like that worked out pretty well. If that doesn't do it, kind of wipe it down, then come back in with your pencil, kind of target the areas, the light areas in there with these kind of circular motions, feather it out, and then try to remove that splotch that way. So it's really just, I'm barely scraping the surface there. Kind of smooth it out, and then if you need to, kind of continue to kind of press and lift with the kneaded eraser. A lot can be done with that kneaded eraser to kind of remove some blotches. But those blotches can sometimes be formed by imperfections on the paper. Sometimes there's just some sort of manufacturing flaw. It's often caused by oily fingers on the surface there. So as you're working with the blank sheet, sometimes we'll touch it with our fingers and it'll leave an oily spot, and that will hold the material a little bit more. Sometimes it's just a technique issue where we have marks that overlap and are not as smooth as we'd like them to be. But just know that those blotches, they kind of happen to everybody. All right. Let's see. All right, thanks everybody for comments. Monica's saying that you're more detail-oriented, detail-focused. Greg, yeah, definitely. Your work, Greg, is highly detailed. All right, yeah, those details, like I said, are kind of tricky. And again, I think for me, it all comes down to what experience you want to have as the artist. It's a term that we've used here that marks are thoughts, marks are records of the kind of the experience of the artist with the page, with the materials, and so you want to be kind of mindful of that, of like what kind of relationship you want to have with the materials and with the subject matter, and build it from there. The term I like to use is working at the speed of thought. So find the medium and the way of working that aligns with your natural processing speed. So as I'm working down here, again, I've got those lines here that are helping to serve as guides more for the perspective than anything. I'm just going to be more suggestive, mostly because of time. We're already an hour and 40 minutes in, so I don't want to keep you here forever. But I think if we'll get into some of the details on this side, but I need enough on this edge here to so that it doesn't become a distraction. That can be the real challenge sometimes, is knowing if there's not enough information, it can become a distraction. If there's too much information, that can sometimes be a distraction. or kind of pull away from the focal point. Oh, and then I believe there was a question about sharing the work earlier. So there is a link that's pinned to the top of the chat, and it's also in the description where you can share your work. So if you are drawing along, I'd love to see what you all are working on. So share that on the Drawing Together page on Artist Network. And there's a specific episode page on which you can share your work. Kind of like what's happening in here. So I think we're just going to leave it. It seems to be resonating well, even though it's all very loose. So this is one of those situations where I kind of like the mark making as abstractions, and so I'm just going to let them be. Sometimes that doesn't work out always. Sometimes I want that to be the case. I want to create really nice, elegant, abstract marks, and it just doesn't work. And so I don't want to force it. But if I see marks that they're working with the perspective, and I feel like there's something interesting there, I'll just let them be. So I'm going to come back over on this side, refine this edge a little bit. So looking at that negative space here, refining the shape of the column. And then I can come back in here. And just with a light touch, I'm more blending than anything. I'm just starting to indicate some of the lines there. And so using the eraser to kind of carve away, but I'm not being very heavy-handed at all, because I don't want to lift off anything in here that's going to compete with the lights in other parts of the drawing. But this can be a way to start to suggest the shape of these bricks. And you can get really precise if you want to there. Or you can just be more suggestive, which I'm gonna do here. So it's you can see how much charcoal is building up on the back side of this eraser. So that's showing that it's really just smudging it more than anything. And it's starting to create some interesting texture. So you could be using the blending stump as well for this. Kind of suggest some of the texture there. Maybe along this edge I can sharpen up. I want to add a little bit of detail to that edge and really capture that broken quality of that. Well, one of the things we think about, we did that with the seated figure. We're thinking about this subject as though we were on location. If I ever get a chance to travel here, what would it be like to sit at this location and sketch? Would I have enough time to create a fully rendered drawing? Would I have to work quickly? And if I have to work quickly, what information is most relevant? All right, I think I will have to adjust things a little bit more. Let's see, this is still a little bit dark. I might have to really kind of pull out some more light there. So I'm going to target some of these areas where it's a little bit blotchy. So it's just with these circular motions. And this is where it's helpful, again, to have that vertical projection, because I'm not seeing in these blotches when I look at it from this angle, but when I see it up on the screen, it becomes more apparent. That can be a tool for you to use as well as take a photograph of your work and look at the thumbnail, see if anything stands out as needing work refinement there. All right. And you got these like the rust stains or whatever the stains are that are kind of running down it are really kind of fascinating. We'll try to see if we can address those in a little bit as well. So I'm thinking in terms of my mark making as cross contour marks. So following the contour this way as well as vertically. Those are really the only two directions that I want to be running my materials to help reinforce the perspective a bit. All right, how's everybody doing? Liz, it worked for you, huh? Awesome, congrats. Excellent, thank you. Samantha, talking about the weathered look using the eraser. And Ursula, I love to work on, I just lost your comment there. Love to work on details, but in a looseness way. That's awesome. It's an interesting way to put it. It totally makes sense. Let's see. Deanne, I like that comment there, to not just work on one section of the drawing and let the picture evolve. Yeah, the thing is I've learned from experience. My natural inclination was to kind of finish one area, move to the next, finish that, move to the next, and it was never working. It was never feel unified. So then I think actually the painting process helped me to break that habit, because I paint very similarly, where I'll build up, wipe it down, build it up, wipe it down, and in that way you're developing the whole drawing at once, and then try to apply that to the or a whole painting at once and then apply that to drawing, and that can sometimes be helpful. So now I'm observing that this needs a little bit of attention, but I gotta loosen up a little bit. I'm getting all in my head right now. Samantha, when I was there, it was super hot. There's no way you could sit there for long. Oh, interesting. Yeah, and then Greg, I think you've got if you haven't checked out Greg's work, check it out. Very kind of rich architectural drawings. But I think your process makes sense. I think so in terms of the detail, like as long as you have that main structure there, then you're in control of how much detail you add. And so as long as you start from a sense that everything's going to fit together, then you can go in and finish one spot, move to the next, finish to the next. But what was happening for me is that it just takes me a while to really understand how all the parts fit together. So I would kind of rough something in, think I have it correct, finish the whole thing and add all this detail, only to realize that I really hadn't worked through it. So I think that's really the key for me that I needed to address, and why I really found that this process works better for me. But again, I think whatever works for you and what kind of experience that you want to have as an artist. So, because our drawings are records of experiences that we're having. All right, I think half of that side of the drawing just ended up on my hands as I was working earlier, so I'll have to come in and adjust that. And then Jessica saying you were there also. It would be amazing to go here, so I hope I could do that someday. And that can be helpful sometimes, is to kind of prepare using a photograph and kind of work through a bunch of issues, practice using the photograph in anticipation of being on location sometime. All right, I'm glad you've learned a lot, people. Awesome, Aaron. All right, I'm gonna get back to it. I think I could finish up adding the details pretty quickly here. So I'm trying to figure out where I need to go first. I think knowing that my hand is likely gonna smudge this whole area, I think I'll start up here and work my way down so I don't finish this, move up, only to lose this. So I think what I'll do is, I guess I'll be strategic with line for this, as long as I have a general understanding of the form here and the light and shadow. I'm going to try to just be selective of where I'm adding some of these darker darks. So this is now the 6B pencil, so I can get a little bit darker. And I think these overhand marks kind of suggest kind of cracks and light and shadow a little bit more effectively than switching to a tripod grip. So that's why what I'm doing there. But I don't know if I want to actually do a whole lot more detail. I think if I can just suggest these forms, I'll be doing all right. Okay, so this is where I realized that I'm not talking as much because I am focusing a bit more. And so this is more of I'm just kind of dragging the pencil along the core, the pencil core there. So when it's helpful to have it kind of sharpened down to expose more of that core. And then just think about the edges and which edges I really need to clarify. All right, I want to come back in here and add some of these cracks and crevices. Lost and found edges are really kind of a fun concept. The idea that you have an edge that's really just kind of broken, and it can often feel more comfortable for the viewer because it aligns with how we actually perceive the world, especially with a large form like this. If we were to be here on location, we would observe, this one spot here, and it'd be a nice straight line, and we come up here and we'd observe that spot, and our brain would kind of stitch those together, but optically they would actually be broken. So you can kind of focus on that when you look at if you're in a room, for example, look at a wall. Be focused on one section of that wall, but put your awareness on something else. So be looking at one area while thinking about another, and you realize they don't quite line up. The picture only really gets completed as you move your eye around, just like our smartphones, when you put them in panoramic mode, it stitches together all these different photos to create that look. Our brain kind of does the same thing. All right. Again, just kind of concentrating a little bit more now, thinking about these curves. So Greg, did you had asked last week about the perspective with the windows here, the ellipses. Does that help at all? Anybody else have any kind of questions about the perspective? So as I'm kind of working, there's this ledge here, I'm kind of working my way down. As I do, I'm trying to do kind of quick check-in to make sure that I'm getting the perspective correct. It gets a little bit tricky, you know, with all these kind of jagged edges. You know, we want to make the perspective feel correct while also accounting for these kind of funky edges that are all broken. And if you're trying to get the stains on the side of the wall, the patina, you know, what I like to do is I take the pencil and on its side, and there's really kind of a high point a little bit in from the tip, and that's the part that's making contact with the page. And as you kind of drag down, again following the cross contour, it'll deposit kind of this nice irregular mark that can suggest that patina. Now it's not 100% accurate. I kind of let the mark making do its own thing. So I'm kind of taking visual clues from the reference rather than you know, directly copying it. But that's kind of what I'm thinking about there. This one feels a little bit, this window here felt a little bit too big. There we go. Rein that in a little bit. And then just think about one of the things about perspective is that as you kind of work around that, we're shearing across that surface, so you're fitting in, you know, so if say you've got, you know, 1, 2, 3 windows here, and that takes up about 1/3 of the page. The next 3 windows takes up a much smaller fraction of that. The next 3 windows takes up a very thin sliver, right? So you're taking all of that information and you're cramming it into a smaller space. And so if you kind of keep that in your mind as you're working backwards, then it's just a matter of tightening up your marks. And then this, again, you can be kind of as precise and detailed as you want or as loose as you want, but it can be helpful to kind of hold that general principle in your mind of the things just getting kind of tighter as you kind of wrap around there, as you shear across the surface a little bit more. Awesome, Greg. I'm glad that worked out. Yeah, that it sure is tricky. And I think one of the things that for kind of ovals and ellipses, things like that, that really helped me is to intentionally break them down into shorter straight marks. And then in that way it becomes, it ended up becoming more kind of precise. All right, I'll just refine this edge a little bit more, doing some negative drawing in here. Really kind of tucking that top row back in. So you know, now as we work back in here, really look at that intersection point. Those are going to be key, those intersection points. And let these marks just kind of wrap around. So if you squint your eyes, this makes a general angle, and that's what we established early on in the drawing. But then as we give it more focus, then you can start to create a more specific combination of marks to achieve that. So you have that general axis, but then you can come back in and you can see how it's actually an accumulation of these various stretches there. I think that works out all right. You know, we're missing a lot of detail in there, but I think that's okay. Again, this is now where you're in control of how much detail. So you could go in there and just focus on this one area, and in general, it would all fit together. What do I need to do here? This gets really tricky. In this stretch in here, so I think I need to add a little bit of sharpness, but I don't know exactly where. So sometimes drawing comes down to really just experimenting and seeing what works. So kind of testing things out. So you're like, well, what happens if I just become a little bit more detail back in here, and then try out a mark and see, does that work? And if not, you can erase it out. I feel like that works out all right. What I like about this overhand grip that I've got here too is when you're using the side of the pencil, it's always kind of sharpening that point to some degree, and so then I can use it to really extract some of those details. Let me see here. All right, I think I kind of lost some of the light in that window. So we'll erase that out, and I think I lost it in here too. So I think about that quite a bit when drawing, is that there's so many times it's drawing the same thing over and over again. I'm like, I could have sworn I had already drawn that part. But then, of course, it gets smudged or something else changes, and so you just got to be comfortable revisiting areas that you thought were done. And that's where it can be really helpful to kind of set a drawing aside and look at it later, even a few days later. I think what I'm going to do is actually I want to leave this lower section kind of unfinished, and that's going to hopefully encourage a looking upward, which then will kind of reinforce really the power of this building, the idea that it naturally draws the gaze up. And so I think I want to do that. Just let that be unfinished. So I want it to be about that experience of being pulled upward. And so if I extend that thinking, then it'd be appropriate, I think, to add a little bit more detail, sharpen up this top portion a little bit more. And then this is where this little strip of paper can be handy. So you can mask an area like this to get a sharp edge. Or you can actually kind of score along the edge, just like I was doing before. Actually, what I want to do is this. Actually, I think this one. Now I know what I want to do. So just sharpen up that edge by placing that down and lifting that edge along here a little bit. Yeah, so some of those values are really kind of blending together. So if I need to darken it, I can come back in with my blending stump that's all loaded with material. I can darken this a bit, hopefully create a little bit more contrast. So when using that blending stump, I'm still trying to be mindful of the cross contour information. So running those marks, to support the dimension of the building. So vertically, horizontally. Now this is in that window, so I can be a little bit more free in the sky areas. But I think that this is really starting to pretty much do it. We can keep working on this for quite a while, but I know you all have been with me for now over 2 hours, which is it's a lot. So I think I'll pretty much call it a day. Any other kind of questions, observations, things like that? Anything anybody wanted me to cover we didn't get to? I look forward to seeing all the drawings. So again, go to that link that's been provided in the description and at the top of the chat here. You can share your work with everybody. I'd love to see what you got. So this is, like I said, this is a fun one. It's a fun one for me. It sounds like it was an enjoyable challenge for many of you as well. So. Let's see. All right, thank you, JC. Yeah, Greg, I hear what you're saying about know the perspective trick for ellipses, but get lazy and eyeball them most of the time. And then, yeah, no, I know what you mean, but I think eyeballing too is also kind of I don't know, sometimes it's just fun, and it's a way to inject some of your own personality into the drawing. That's your interpretations. Oh, that's right. I do want to add a little bit more specificity to this, just a little bit of an indication of what's happening down in here. So there's just some quick sketchy marks. They're lower down, so I don't want to draw too much attention, because again, this hopefully will help to create that upward kind of thrust of the subject matter. But next week we're working with just a basic still life, just a white picture that will really help us to confront edges and value control. So I'm really looking forward to that. I started that drawing, and that'll be done in graphite. But again, you can use really any medium that you want. But I try to change up the subject matter, so go from a landscape to a portrait to, a still life or something that's figurative. Try to change things up as much as possible. But we got some exciting ones coming up this next month as we keep moving forward with the show. So I want to thank you all for joining me. Again, we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, to draw together. Tell your friends. I know some of you have indicated that you formed kind of these breakout groups to share your process, and that is really awesome. And some of you are doing this as part of larger kind of communities, and so I want to thank you all for making this so much fun for me. But I'm going to sign off. Hopefully this all makes sense. There are some areas that I might keep working on just to kind of bring this to an end, but I think you've seen pretty much everything that I can throw at this thing, so it's mostly what's left is more of what you've already seen. So all right, I appreciate it. Thanks you all for the kind words. This was a lot of fun. I will see you next Wednesday. Have a great weekend, and we'll draw a fun picture.